Part 3 of The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose, starting with Section 6. To return to the topic of good philosophy, it would be mistaken to assume that Humean thinkers believe opposite or opposing premises of bad philosophers. Instead, we see a denial of the philosophical game and dialectic entirely. In Humean thinkers, we can detect an obsession with suspension of judgment as a way of life, a suspension that alone succeeds in forcing philosophy into a radical examination of itself. Livingston wrote, "The Humean does not claim that reality cannot be known. That would be dogmatism. He leaves the question open and is willing to consider any claim about the real, but experience has taught him that peace of mind does not come from theorizing about the real, and so the point of inquiry is always to bring theorizing to bay by showing that the contrary of whatever theory is seized upon is as well supported as that theory." The Humean thinker is aware that since the skeptic can never entirely suppress the desire to philosophize, his happiness is never complete and always exists against a background of philosophical anxiety. And thus, if a Humean thinker becomes a dogmatist about skepticism, the Humean re-enters the very anxiety he or she was supposed to escape. Skepticism serves as an ally, but in due subordination, not as an equal to common life. At the same time, no one can be a true philosopher unless he or she has passed through the moment of vulgar consciousness and false philosophical consciousness. Good philosophy is only found on the other side of bad philosophy. It must be walked through, its temptations suffered. The appreciation of the authority of common opinion is possible only for true philosophers who have run the circle of the dialectic, and this entails very real but necessary risk if the oppressive negatives of common life are to be managed, such as those discussed in Belonging Again. Only true philosophers recognize the authority of the unrational common life, and so recognize that they are no different from the unreflective commoners in being participants in custom. As a useful aside, and as discussed in Through Nothing We Know with the NO in parentheses by O.G. Rose, it can be useful to draw a distinction between the irrational and the unrational or non-rational, and do note the UN is in parentheses for unrational, and do note that the fact we only have the term irrational contributes to the fallacy of thinking if X is not a matter of rationality, then it is irrational or foolish. Furthermore, thinking this way, we come to believe that all phenomena fall within the dichotomy of rational versus irrational, further privileging rationality. Considering the distinction between truth and rationality, truth and common life are ultimately matters of unrationality, and the act of trying to replace unrationality with rationality is for rationality to negate its own possibility. Unfortunately, in only having at our disposal the dichotomy of rational and irrational, when we think about the unrational, we necessarily think about it as irrational, and thus believe there is need to fix it with and into rationality. Thus, the dichotomy contributes to our attempts to achieve autonomous rationality, a necessarily self-effacing goal. Hume hoped to bring embarrassment to self-determining reason purged of custom and the workings of the metaphoric imagination, thus his reflections on identity, causality, and so on. He viewed embarrassment as a corrective for philosophical pride, and it is the subversion of the pride by the Humean doubt that enables the philosopher to break free of the grip of a corrupt philosophical consciousness. Paradoxically, Humean thought, through a more refined development of the philosophical intellect, is not only disowned by the bad or heroic philosopher, but is considered its greatest threat. And it is not by chance that the unveiling of the paradox of the situation was best carried out through paradoxes, thus the nature of a treatise of human nature by Hume. The absurdities, self-deceit, and hypocrisy of heroic philosophical consciousness are the result of a radically self-determining reason, and so are self-imposed, and the grip can be broken only by the force of the Humean doubt which shatters the seamless whole of self-determining reason. But for this very reason, it is difficult for the heroic philosopher to pass through the Humean door of salvation. Unlike ordinary resentment, which, if just, is caused by things within the world of custom, philosophical resentment, being a passion attended upon self-determining reason, is self-imposed. Nothing in the world can break a person out of it, only the person's self. No adjustments within the world of custom can extinguish these melancholy passions that naturally attend the heroic moment of philosophical reflection. But once a person has entered into bad philosophy, it is only by realizing the impossibility of autonomous reasoning that a person can escape. But it is unlikely a person will realize this, precisely because rationality itself deems it rational to remain in bad philosophy. One must transition out of rationality into natural belief, but it is precisely because of rationality the person has journeyed as far as he or she has. So why would the individual change course now, especially considering that without philosophy at all, common life is oppressive, and thus the individual has just reason to trust in reason, as the individual has reason to trust it, since rationality deems itself rational to ascribe to exclusively. The hold rationality grips people in is incredibly strong, but if it is not broken, the melancholy and destructive ends of philosophy cannot be avoided. We will end up like characters in the work of Walker Percy, the moviegoer, The Last Gentleman, and so on. As Hume realized, rationality is only one of many methods of apprehension, but accepting that there are more forms of apprehension, emotion, intuition, experience, action, love, imagination, requires faith, because we cannot render those alternative apprehensions intelligible with rationality. Hence, a life without faith is a life attempting autonomous rationality. Consequently, you likely cannot feel like accepting alternative apprehensions is the right choice. Perhaps it is impossible to please God without faith, but on the other hand, it seems impossible to please humans with it. However, the very fact that rationality requires truth in order to be itself, a truth which rationality could not apprehend alone, gives us reason to assent to alternative apprehensions. This can be frightening, though, not only existentially in the reality that we cannot fully grasp ourselves intelligently, but also because it means there are unrational ways of knowing that people could use to brainwash and deceive us. Yet it is precisely this possibility that requires us not to abandon rationality altogether, despite its incompleteness. Rationality can protect us from being brainwashed, even if in rationality is the temptation to view self-effacing autonomous rationality as a possibility. As Hume realized, for us to use rationality with the right balance, it must be subservient to common life. For Hume, tradition apprehends for its people, and those people will find themselves happiest if they learn to use their philosophical abilities to suspend philosophical judgment and to defend common life from new philosophical systems so that they can participate in common life uninterrupted. This is a paradox, for a point of philosophy is to question common life, and certainly Hume believed there is a role for philosophy in refining and correcting traditions and communities. However, there is a difference between philosophy that seeks to deconstruct community and philosophy that seeks to strengthen it, both by correcting it when it is wrong and in defending it against outside forces. Common life without philosophy at all is oppressive, but so is philosophy without common life. The antagonistic brothers must learn to live together. With On Thinking and Perceiving by O.G. Rose in mind, thought is naturally more deconstructive than constructive, precisely because its nature is to defend one thing from another, draw out a thing from its context and focus, and to break things down into their parts in order to understand them. Thought likewise seems better at critiquing than creating, at finding problems and imperfections with values, peoples, and ideas versus seeing in what ways these entities are good. For Hume, to only think deconstructively is too easy. The true philosophy takes a second step into learning how to preserve and create. Simplicity that is not earned through thought is fragile, but it's the nature of thought to complexify simplicity, thus causing existential anxiety, abandonment, and deconstruction. Furthermore, as has already been discussed, placing common life above philosophical judgment feels like making oneself vulnerable to manipulation. For Hume, though life without rationality invites brainwashing, using rationality to defend and preserve common life is to engage in brain cleaning, per se. Thought divided from everyday life muddies our minds down with bad philosophy, philosophical systems, long chains of deductions that cannot be falsified, unnecessary metaphysics, and so on. Good philosophy requires philosophical mastery in order to cut through dangerous philosophical ideas. And though skeptic in its nature, the skepticism is more so directed against philosophy itself than against common life. Toward philosophy, Hume tried to deconstruct. Toward common life, Hume tried to refine. It is natural for our minds to wander toward bad philosophy, and so paradoxically we need philosophy in order to keep that from happening. For rationality can be rationality's corrective. That said, we must still learn to engage in other forms of life than the philosophical life, and not forget to tend our gardens. Section 7. The philosophy of Hume, according to Livingston explained, it is now time for the essay to address its second main concern, the similarities and differences between Hume, postmodernism, and deconstruction. Much of Hume's thought will resonate with individuals concerned about how the Enlightenment project has been a force of oppression against minorities. Autonomous rationality has often been white rationality, and furthermore, postmodernists often stress that rationalities are always situated within a certain system of assumptions that reflect a particular culture, race, class, and or common life. Was Hume the first postmodernist, or are there differences between him and Derrida that we should address? Both Hume and postmodern deconstruction, a vague blanket category I understand, which I will signify with PD moving forward, are passionate about making people a little less certain about life. Both view certainty as a major cause of philosophical arrogance and privilege creation. Hume believed that to stop certainty, the individual needs to leave common life and enter the philosophical journey, only for him or her to ultimately return to common life. This way, the individual isn't overly certain in either common life or philosophical reasoning. In both, at best, the individual achieves confidence, a topic expanded on in On Certainty by O.G. Rose. Certainty in common life contributes to oppression and ardent banality of evil, while certainty in philosophical reasoning leads to the totalitarian dangers and self-effacement of autonomous rationality. It is important that an individual not be overly invested in either. PD shares Hume's skepticism of rationality and concern with certainty, and the multicultural dimension of PD also stresses multiple rationalities and the idea that there is no such thing as a philosophical system which isn't situated and defined as itself within a particular people, time, and space. It would be mistaken to say that PD is nihilistic, for though it can be nihilistic in different ways, sophisticated PD argues that uppercase truth may exist, but we cannot know for sure even if it does. And regardless, we must create for ourselves lowercase truths that may or may not reflect uppercase truth. We cannot know either way. Sophisticated PD, precisely in being more epistemically nihilistic, cannot be existentially nihilistic. For if we cannot be certain of anything, we cannot be certain that life has no meaning. Most PD thinkers would certainly claim they don't believe in God, but the wise ones take the position with an open mind. They don't believe God exists, but they don't believe God can't exist either. PD has gone to great lengths to argue that conclusions we believe are given to us by objective rationality and logic are in fact given to us from our lived experience, similar to how Hume made arguments about causality, constant conjunction, and the like to highlight that rationality cannot be the source of our natural beliefs. He made points that people have taken with philosophical seriousness to make points against philosophical seriousness. Like Daniel Dennett, PD argues that much of philosophy is merely privilege, chimesse, a meaningless search for high-order truths that have no practical significance. And this seems to be exactly the point Hume was trying to make, even though, ironically, he is often associated with being a father of much chimesse thinking. Hume argued that we cannot prove the sun will rise tomorrow in order to show the belief is not rational but natural, and thus rationality must make space in itself for natural beliefs. Similarly, PD has attacked the history of science, the Enlightenment, and other philosophical projects to show not that truth doesn't exist, but to show that truth is always situated. And again, if it is like uppercase truth, we cannot be certain. Like Hume, PD has been wrongly accused of nihilistic projects with goals opposite of its actual intentions. But what are the real differences between Humean skepticism and postmodern deconstruction? Both have realized the errors of autonomous rationality and the Enlightenment, but I'm of the opinion that while Hume would not claim it has all thus been a waste of time, PD seems more ready to throw out tradition and philosophy in general. Gilles Deleuze doesn't. He argues the history of philosophy provides us with useful and creative models with which to understand the world, even if we can't say for sure which models point us toward uppercase truth. But generally, PD seems to want to start all over or be done with philosophy once and for all. After all, why do we still need it in light of the incredible advances in science and technology? This isn't to say sophisticated PD is after a view from nowhere, to use Thomas Nagel's term, for PD doesn't believe objectivity is possible, but rather it is to say that PD seems to believe that Western philosophy is so corrupted by privilege that it needs to be remade, if not outright discarded. Again, I generalize, but I do think it's fair to say that the desire to deconstruct in PD is much stronger than the same desire in Hume. The method of Humean wisdom is to become proficient at thinking up such arguments so that one will be disturbed as little as possible by the intrusion of new philosophical theory. One can easily imagine a PD thinker arguing something similar, that it is important for people to become proficient at deconstruction precisely in order to stop arguments that secretly perpetuate white privilege, patriarchy, and so on from intruding progressive society. There is certainly a distrust of rationality in PD, and again, PD stresses the ultimate incompleteness of rationality. But while Humean skeptics and PD agree on symptoms, there seems to be a subtle difference in what they think could be the cure. Both PD and Humean thought ascribe to a suspension of judgment, but while the Humean mostly uses philosophy to deconstruct in order to make space for a common life that already exists, PD deconstructs to make space for a common life that must be created. While Hume stressed an eventual return to common life, PD stresses the need for new community, one that is more diverse and freer from the bigoted traditions of the past. And seeking new community, is PD acknowledging the necessity of participation in custom and the authority of the domain of custom, or is it actually denying the importance of custom and seeking to replace it with new custom? This is a key question, for in one way, PD embraces the importance of common life, and yet in another, it completely disregards it. It's almost as if PD believes that due to racism, bigotry, and other forms of oppression, it is not possible to return to common life because there was never any common life to begin with. All that has ever existed so far has been power structures. Hence, while PD accepts the Humean critique of rationality, PD only at best accepts part of the Humean solution. Perhaps for the PD one day we will be able to acknowledge the superior role of custom and tradition, but not until we create a new custom and tradition free of white privilege, patriarchy, and what have you. For now, while critiquing the incompleteness of rationality outside common life, we must abandon custom and tradition so that they can be replaced with more just sources of social and individual life. Again, I generalize, and it certainly doesn't follow that critiquing one common life as privileged and oppressive means that PD critiques every common life, but I do think it's fair to argue that PD wants to move beyond what the majority of Americans believe is America's tradition, for example. And Hume would not be outright against this. Again, givens sometimes need to be changed and refined. But are the givens ultimately being changed to conform to autonomous rationality, or because the people in a common life themselves have changed? This question might highlight differences between Hume and PD, as does also the point that I think it's fair to argue that while Hume would first point out the advantages of common life and then the problems, PD would first point out the problems, then the advantages. Both have different default modes of thinking, starting concerns, and focuses. For Hume, people must change first, then common life. For PD, society has too much power over people to expect them to change before society does. PD seems much more skeptical than Hume of people's capacity to change society as opposed to being changed by society. That said, it's false to think that Hume didn't think society was powerful. Precisely the opposite is why Hume believed the philosophical journey was necessary. Arguably, Hume understood that common life had to be powerful, for otherwise it couldn't bring order and direction to people's lives. And he also understood, like PD thinkers, that it took a long time for people to change on their own if it wasn't mandated down to them from political powers. Yet while for Hume this isn't a problem, but the natural slow evolution of natural beliefs, for the PD compelled by justice, slow social evolution preserves and contributes to injustice. Justice compels the PT to tap into political power that Hume was not so compelled to exercise. In fact, he believed it was dangerous, but the PD might reply it's easy to worry about the dangers of quick social change when you yourself are not suffering oppression. While Hume believed we must take the entire philosophical journey before we could fully grasp the role of common life in philosophy, the PD doesn't seem to think the philosophical journey is necessary, only accepting the conclusion that philosophy is ultimately incomplete. Generally, it seems Hume did not believe we can move beyond a system before we are philosophically gifted enough to enter the system and see that it is internally consistent like other systems we have entered and inspected, and thus leave the system behind on grounds that it is equally likely to be true as other systems. Common life must be given the breaking vote. PD, on the other hand, seems to believe the fact a system causes oppression, injustice, and/or restrictions is grounds enough to leave the system behind, and also it doesn't seem as if philosophical skill is necessary. We know systems are ultimately founded on hidden assumptions and presuppositions that likely privilege certain groups, so what's the point in studying systems to learn and or confirm what we already know? In fact, Taking the time to confirm such would lengthen the amount of time an injustice could perpetuate. Deciding to confirm something, especially what we already know, is in of itself a mechanism of empowering privilege. For the PD, going on the philosophical journey to experience the problem of internally consistent systems, for example, is not only unnecessary, but unjust. The Humean critiques systems in their incompleteness on grounds that they are all equally true, while the PD emphasizes that they are all equally false. While Hume believed these realizations should inspire us to return to common life, the PD generally believes these realizations should inspire us to create new systems, to push for greater political action, and or to abandon philosophical systems altogether in favor of systems grounded on science. Where Hume stressed a return, the PD stresses progress. Where Hume stressed appealing to tradition, the PD stresses cultivation of creativity. Both Hume and PD identify the same problem, but in the Humean mind, the PD proceeds to make the problem worse, while in the PD mind, Hume's solution is weak in stopping privilege and social oppression. Both believe the other looks a monster in the eyes and waves. This has been part 3 of Deconstructing Common Life. For more, please visit ogrose.com on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and thank you for your time.